The air at the Henderson County Equipment Auction hung thick and heavy, a humid August cocktail of diesel exhaust, sweat, and stale coffee. It was 1979, and the mood was electric, almost frantic. Men who were usually cautious, who'd count every penny twice, were bidding with a kind of fevered desperation, their eyes gleaming with the promise of $5 corn and land values that had nowhere to go but up. I stood near the back, leaning against the rusty fender of an old Ford F-250, my arms crossed over my chest. My name is Earl Miller. I farmed the same quarter section my grandfather broke with a team of mules, plus the 80 acres my father bought after the war. It was all mine, free and clear. The dirt, the house, the barns, and every piece of iron sitting in them. That fact was a quiet source of pride, a bedrock under my feet in a world that felt like it was shifting into quicksand. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Slim, was working the crowd into a lather over the crown jewel of the sale. A brand new, gleaming International Harvester 1480 axial flow combine. It was a monster, a leviathan of red steel that made my old John Deere 95 look like a child's toy. It had an air-conditioned cab, a grain tank that could hold 200 bushels, and a 20-foot header that could swallow a field whole. It was the future, and every farmer under the age of 40 was staring at it like it was a woman in a red dress. "Look at that machine, boys," Slim bellowed, his voice cracking through the loudspeakers. "She's got the big 6-cylinder turbo diesel, hydrostatic drive, rock trap, grain loss monitor. This ain't your daddy's combine. This is a money-making machine. Who'll start the bidding at $70,000? 70. Do I hear 70? A hush fell over the crowd. $70,000. That was more than my father paid for his entire farm. It was a staggering sum, a number that felt unreal. But then a hand shot up from the front row. Richard Peterson. Of course, Rich was a few years younger than me, all slicked back hair and ambition that burned so hot you could feel it from 10 feet away. He'd taken over his father's farm 5 years back and had been expanding aggressively ever since, gobbling up every parcel that came up for sale. He drove a new Lincoln Continental, his wife wore fancy clothes, and he talked about leverage and cash flow like a banker from Des Moines. He saw farming not as a way of life, but as a business portfolio. "I got 70 from Mr. Peterson," Slim cried, pointing a long bony finger. "Now who'll give me 71? 71,000. Another man, a farmer from the next county over, raised his paddle. The bidding war was on. It climbed fast, 75, 80, 82. The numbers were dizzying, disconnected from the reality of dirt and sweat and the ever-present threat of drought or hail. This wasn't about farming anymore. It was about ego. I watched, silent. My own main machine was a 1968 John Deere 4020 with the side console synchro range. It was a legend, maybe the best tractor Deere ever built. I knew every bolt on it, the particular groan the hydraulics made on a cold morning, the exact spot on the throttle where the diesel engine found its sweet spot and hummed like a giant bee. It was paid for. My combine was an old John Deere 95 with a corn head, the round back model from the late 60s. It was slow, noisy, and it didn't have a cab, but it did the job, and if it broke, I could fix it with a wrench and a welder. I didn't owe a dime on any of it. The bidding on the 1480 stalled at 86,000. Slim worked his magic, trying to coax another bid, but the second farmer just shook his head and shoved his hands in his pockets. "Sold," Slim shouted, slamming his gavel down. $86,000 to Richard Peterson. "Give the man a hand, boys." A smattering of applause broke out. Rich stood up, a triumphant smirk on his face, and turned to shake hands with the bank representative who was standing right behind him, clipboard in hand. He was signing the papers right there, leveraging the future for the present. As Rich made his way through the crowd, accepting congratulations, his eyes landed on me. He changed his course and walked over, his new cowboy boots crunching on the gravel. "Well, Earl," he said, his voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Enjoying the show, or just seeing what you'll be competing against?" I just nodded. "It's a big machine, Rich." "It's the best machine," he corrected, puffing out his chest. "You can't make money in this game running a museum. A man's got to keep up. Get big or get out, that's what they say." He gestured vaguely in the direction of my old Ford truck. "You still running that old 95 combine?" "She still runs," I said, my voice flat. He chuckled, a condescending sound that set my teeth on edge. "Yeah, I bet she does." "Well, don't work yourself to death on that thing. While you're out there choking on dust for a week, I'll be done in 2 days." Sitting in my air-conditioned cab, listening to the radio. He clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to seem friendly but felt like a shove. "Progress, Earl. You can't fight it." He walked away, leaving me standing there in the cloud of his arrogance. The men around us who had overheard the exchange looked away, some with a bit of pity, others with the same smug superiority as Rich. They saw me as a relic, a stubborn old fool clinging to the past while the smart money was on the future. I stood there for a long time, watching them load that massive red combine onto a lowboy trailer. The sun beat down on my neck. I could feel the weight of their judgment, the quiet dismissal. They were all chasing the same dream, a dream built on borrowed money and the hope that the good times would never end. I had a different dream. To sleep at night, knowing that whatever happened, the land beneath my feet was my own. But in that moment, watching that gleaming machine leave the auction yard, I felt a flicker of doubt. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was just a fool. Now, before we go any further with this story, I want to ask you all something. Have you ever known a man like me? A man who stuck to his guns with old paid-for iron, while everyone around him was chasing the latest and greatest on the bank's dime? Maybe it was your father, your grandfather, or a neighbor down the road. Let me know down in the comments below. I'd surely love to hear your stories about those men of conviction. 2 months later, the doubt I'd felt at the auction had been replaced by the familiar ache of hard work. The corn stood tall and dry in the fields, the leaves rustling in the crisp October wind, a sound like money in the bank. It was the prettiest crop I'd had in years. The nights were getting colder, and the urgency of harvest was a constant pressure in my chest. I had spent the last week getting the old John Deere 95 ready. I'd changed the oil in the 303 cubic inch Detroit diesel, greased every Zerk fitting until the old grease pushed out, and sharpened the snapping rolls on the 4-row cornhead. She wasn't pretty. The green paint was faded to a pale, chalky mint, and rust bloomed along the edges of the sheet metal like a persistent rash. But she was mine, and she was ready. Or so I thought. I fired her up on a Monday morning, the Detroit engine barking to life in a cloud of blue-black smoke before settling into its distinctive clattering idle. I engaged the separator, and the whole machine began to shake and roar, the belts and chains singing their familiar harvest song. I drove it out of the machine shed and headed for the north field, the one closest to the road. I made one pass, the old machine gobbling up the corn stalks, the ears rattling up the feeder house, the shelled corn auguring into the grain tank. Everything felt right. I swung her around for the second pass, and that's when it happened. There was a high-pitched squeal, a sound of tortured metal that made my blood run cold. It was followed by a loud bang, like a gunshot, and a violent shudder that shook the entire combine. The variable speed drive for the cylinder went slack. The cylinder itself, the heavy heart of the machine that threshes the grain from the cob, spun down with a dying groan. I slammed the throttle back and shut down the engine, the sudden silence deafening. I sat there for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel, a sick feeling rising in my stomach. I knew that sound. It wasn't a simple belt, it was something deep inside, something catastrophic. I climbed down and opened the side panel. The main variable speed drive belt was shredded, but that was the symptom, not the cause. Peering into the guts of the machine with a flashlight, I saw it. The main sheave on the cylinder drive shaft had frozen solid, the outer half was cocked at a crazy angle, and I could see shattered pieces of metal. The main bearing had seized and completely disintegrated. My heart sank. This wasn't a field repair. This was a teardown, a major one. The cylinder drive shaft was buried deep in the machine, and getting it out meant pulling half the guts out of the combine's left side. Just then, a cloud of dust appeared down the road. It grew larger, resolving into the shape of Rich Peterson's brand-new International 1480, its 20-foot grain head seeming to span the entire road. He was heading to the field directly across from mine. He slowed as he passed, the cab of his combine high above me. He didn't wave. He just looked down at me and my dead machine, then looked at my field of standing corn, and a slow, knowing smile spread across his face. He gave a little shake of his head, then accelerated, the turbo on his diesel whistling as he drove on, leaving me in his dust. The humiliation was a hot poker in my gut. He hadn't said a word, but his message was clear. See? This is what you get for being stubborn. This is what you get for trusting old iron. I spent the rest of that day and all of the next in a greasy hell. I had to pull the straw walkers first, heavy, awkward things that fought me every step of the way. Then came the cleaning shoe, caked with years of chaff and dirt. Finally, I could get a wrench on the bolts holding the bearing housing for the cylinder shaft. They were frozen with rust. I soaked them in penetrating oil, heated them with an acetylene torch until they glowed cherry red, and beat on them with a 3-pound sledgehammer and a long-handled wrench. My knuckles were raw and bleeding, my back screamed in protest, and every muscle ached. My wife, Martha, brought me sandwiches and a thermos of hot coffee, her face etched with worry. "Can you fix it, Earl?" she asked, her voice quiet. "I have to," I said, not looking at her. "There's no other choice." Calling a mechanic was out of the question. It would cost a fortune, and they'd take a week just to show up. Renting another combine was impossible. Every available machine in 3 counties was already running day and night. It was on me. By Wednesday afternoon, I finally got the shaft out. The bearing hadn't just failed. It had welded itself to the shaft and then exploded, chewing up the housing and scoring the shaft itself. The parts weren't something you could just pick up at the local dealer. The John Deere 95 had been out of production for a decade. I spent hours on the phone, calling every salvage yard I knew from Iowa to Nebraska. Most just laughed. Finally, a man in a dusty yard in western Kansas said he might have one. "Got an old 95 we scrapped out a few years back," he said, his voice crackling over the line. "Let me go look. Call me back in an hour." It was the longest hour of my life. I sat in my workshop, the greasy, broken parts laid out on the concrete floor like the bones of some prehistoric beast. Across the road, I could hear the steady, relentless hum of Rich Peterson's combine as it devoured his corn, acre after acre. The sound was a constant reminder of my failure, of time slipping away. The weather forecast on the radio called for a big storm system moving in by the weekend. Rain, maybe even snow. If I didn't get my corn out before then, I could lose a good portion of it. I called the salvage yard back, my hand shaking slightly as I dialed. "Yeah, I found it," the man said. "Bearing and housing look to be in one piece. Shaft's got a little wear, but it's straight. I can have it on the bus tomorrow morning. It'll be in your town by Friday." Relief washed over me so powerfully I felt weak. "I'll take it," I said, "whatever it costs." The next 2 days were a blur of cleaning, scraping, and preparing. I used a grinder to smooth the scoring on my damaged shaft, deciding to keep it as a spare. I cleaned every part I had removed, laying them out in order, ready for reassembly. All the while, Rich's combine kept running. He finished his corn and moved on to his soybeans. The talk at the co-op, as Martha told me, was all about how poor old Earl Miller was going to lose his crop because his antique machinery finally gave up the ghost. They said it was a shame, but that I'd brought it on myself. Friday finally came. The parts arrived on the afternoon bus. They were caked in Kansas dust and grease, but they were beautiful. I worked through the night under the harsh glare of a single light bulb in my shop. The reassembly was a slow, painstaking process. Getting the heavy cylinder shaft back in place by myself, using a chain hoist and a collection of pry bars, was a brutal, exhausting fight. I mashed my finger, gashed my arm on a piece of sheet metal, and swore until I was hoarse. But piece by piece, bolt by bolt, the old machine came back together. At dawn on Saturday morning, with grey clouds massing on the western horizon, I was done. Exhausted, filthy, and running on pure adrenaline, I climbed into the operator's seat. I took a deep breath, turned the key, and pushed the starter button. The Detroit diesel turned over once, twice, then roared to life. I engaged the separator. There was no squeal, no bang, just the familiar thunderous symphony of a working combine. I had done it. I had wrestled the beast and won. I drove it out into the field, the first fat drops of rain just beginning to spatter against the windshield I'd rigged up out of plexiglass. I lowered the header into the corn and pushed the throttle forward, a feeling of grim triumph surging through me. I was running. I wasn't going to be beaten. The next few years were good ones. The early and mid-70s brought a wave of prosperity to the heartland that nobody had ever seen before. The grain deal with the Soviets opened the floodgates. Corn prices stayed high and soybean prices went through the roof. The government was telling us to plant fence row to fence row. And for the first time, it felt like a farmer could actually get ahead. Land that had been selling for $500 an acre was suddenly $1,000, then $1,500, then $2,000. It was a gold rush, and the banks were handing out money like it was candy at a parade. This was Rich Peterson's time to shine. The boom confirmed everything he believed about modern farming. He was no longer just a farmer. He was an agricultural tycoon in the making. The $86,000 combine was just the beginning. He used his rapidly appreciating land value as collateral to borrow more, buying up the old Henderson place when the family retired. That was another 240 acres. Then he bought the 160 next to me when old man Hemlock passed away. His line of equipment became a rolling showcase of the latest and greatest. He traded the 1480 for a brand new 1482, the next model up. He bought a massive four-wheel drive Steiger Panther tractor with dual wheels on all four corners, a machine so big it made my 4020 look like a garden tractor. He bought bigger planters, bigger cultivators, bigger grain trucks. His farm was a testament to the power of leverage, a sprawling empire built on a mountain of debt. He'd see me at the grain elevator and shake his head with a theatrical sigh. "Earl, Earl, Earl," he'd say, leaning against the fender of his shiny new truck. "You're sitting on a gold mine and you're still digging with a teaspoon. Your land's probably tripled in value. You could borrow against it, buy another half section. You're missing the boat." "The boat I'm in is paid for, Rich," I'd say. "You gotta spend money to make money," he'd counter, his voice full of evangelical fervor. "The bank is begging to loan me money. Interest rates are a little high, sure, but with corn at $3.50 a bushel, who cares? It's a guaranteed win." I didn't see it that way. I saw rising costs everywhere. Fuel prices were climbing, fertilizer was more expensive every year, and the cost of parts for my old equipment was going up too. Inflation was eating away at everything. While Rich was expanding, I was fortifying. I used the good years to pay cash for a used but much newer John Deere 7700 combine, a solid, reliable machine that could keep up and take some of the pressure off my old 95. I didn't get rid of the 95 though. I kept her in the shed, a trusted backup. I systematically tiled my low ground, improving drainage and boosting yields on the land I already owned. I built a new, bigger machine shed, paying for the materials as I went and doing all the labor myself. I put money in the bank, hard cash. To everyone else in the county, I was a failure, a man who lacked the vision and the guts to seize the opportunity of a lifetime. They saw Rich Peterson's new equipment and his expanding acreage, and they saw success. They saw my 10-year-old tractor and my cautious ways, and they saw a man being left in the dust. The whispers at the co-op turned from pity to a kind of scorn. I was yesterday's man, a relic who didn't understand the new rules of the game. I let them talk. I kept my head down, did my work, and paid my bills. I trusted the lessons my father had taught me, that the land endures, that debt is a cruel master, and that good times never last forever. I watched the frenzy around me, the soaring land prices and easy credit, and it felt fragile, like a beautiful sheet of ice stretched too thin over deep, cold water. The fall of 1980 was a good one. The harvest came in clean and dry. My yields were excellent, thanks to the new tile and a few timely rains. I filled my bins and sold just enough to cover my taxes and expenses for the coming year. The rest I held, waiting to see what the market would do. One cool evening in late November, I was in my workshop, tuning up the engine on my 4020. I had the radio on, a station out of Des Moines, the voice of the announcer a low murmur under the clatter of my wrenches. He was talking about the economy, about the new Federal Reserve chairman, a man named Paul Volcker. He said Volcker was a man on a mission, determined to break the back of inflation no matter the cost. He mentioned something about the prime interest rate, a number that didn't mean much to me. The next day, the mailman left a letter in our box. It was a thick envelope from the regional bank in the county seat, the one that held the notes on half the farms in the area. But it wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to the Hemlock estate, the people I'd bought my 80 acres from 30 years ago. But it had been delivered to my box by mistake, probably because the mailman knew the Hemlock farm was now part of Rich Peterson's operation next door. Normally, I would have just taken it over to him, but it was one of those official-looking envelopes with a clear window, and through it I could see the words "Notice of Delinquency" in stark red letters. Curiosity got the better of me. I slit the envelope open. It was a notice that the mortgage payment on the old Hemlock place was 30 days past due. But that wasn't what made the air go out of my lungs. It was the numbers listed below. The principal amount was staggering enough, but next to it was the interest rate applied to the loan, a variable rate that had just been adjusted. My eyes scanned the line twice to make sure I was reading it right. 18%. A cold dread, heavy and real, settled in the pit of my stomach. 18%. It was an impossible number, a death sentence. No farm on earth could pay for itself with interest rates like that. I looked at the paper in my hand, then looked out the window of my truck, across my own fields, dark and resting under the grey sky. They were quiet. They were mine. Then I looked north, toward the sprawling lands farmed by Rich Peterson. The silence from that direction felt different. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a paid-for farm at rest. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a bank, waiting for its due. The storm I had long felt gathering on the horizon was no longer distant. It was here, and it was about to break. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into its mangled envelope. The next morning, I drove it over to Rich's place. I found him in his massive, heated workshop, staring at the engine of his Steiger Panther. The tractor's hood was tilted forward, exposing a nightmarish tangle of hydraulic lines, wiring harnesses and diesel plumbing that made my old 4020 look like a child's pedal tractor. He had a service manual the size of a phone book open on a workbench, but his hands were clean. He wasn't working on it. He was just looking, a deep furrow of frustration carved between his eyebrows. "Mailman put this in my box by mistake," I said, holding out the envelope. He snatched it without looking at me, his eyes scanning the red letters through the window. A muscle in his jaw twitched. He ripped it open and read it, his face paling slightly. He crumpled the letter into a tight ball and threw it into a nearby trash can filled with oily rags. "Damn bloodsuckers," he muttered. He looked up at me, his eyes hard and defensive, as if daring me to say something. "Variable rate. They said it was the modern way to finance." 18% is a high price for modern, I said quietly. His face flushed with anger. "What would you know about it, Earl? You're still running on cash from 1955. The world has changed. This is just a temporary correction. The grain prices will come back up." Just then, the phone on his workshop wall rang. He answered it, turning his back to me. His end of the conversation was short, clipped. "Yeah, I know. I'm waiting on the part. The dealer said Tuesday. No, I can't. Look, I'll have it next week." He slammed the phone down. He turned back, and for a second the arrogant mask slipped. I saw a man who was terrified. "Hydraulic pump went out on the Steiger," he said, gesturing at the tractor. "Can't turn the damn thing. It's articulated steering, you know. Without hydraulic pressure, it's just two big chunks of dead iron. Dealer has to order the part from Fargo. $700 for the pump, and God knows what for the service call." I just nodded. I thought of the simple gear and shaft steering on my 4020. If it broke, I could fix it with a wrench. The correction Rich was waiting for never came. Instead, things got worse. President Carter announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. Just like that, our biggest customer was gone. The bottom fell out of the market. Corn that had been $3.50 a bushel was suddenly $2.20 and falling. You couldn't even cover your costs at that price. The elevators were full, and they didn't want to buy. That spring of 1981 was grim. The talk at the co-op was no longer about expansion and new equipment. It was hushed, worried conversations about operating loans and input costs. The bankers who had been so free with their money a year ago were now tight-fisted, demanding more collateral, scrutinizing every line on a balance sheet. I saw the first real cracks in Rich's empire that summer. He was always a meticulous farmer, his fields as clean as a dinner plate. But that year, I saw patches of foxtail creeping up in his beans and shattercane getting a foothold in his corn. He was cutting back on herbicides, trying to save money. His big, new equipment started to look weathered. The gleaming red paint on his combine was caked with mud he hadn't bothered to wash off. He was running too hard, spread too thin, and the pressure was showing. Then the drought hit. It didn't rain in July, and it didn't rain in August. The sun beat down from a merciless metallic sky. The corn leaves curled up tight during the day, a desperate attempt to conserve moisture. They called it a flash drought. It turned a promising crop into a disaster in 6 weeks. My yields were down by a third, but I knew Rich's were worse. His land, especially the newer ground he'd bought, wasn't as well drained or cared for as mine. The harvest that fall was a quiet, desperate affair. The mood of frantic optimism from just 2 years prior was gone, replaced by a grim sense of dread. The prime interest rate, the one that governed Rich's loans, kept climbing. 18% had seemed impossible, then it was 19, then 20. The radio announcers spoke of Paul Volcker's war on inflation in heroic terms, but out here in the fields, it felt like he was waging a war on us. I saw Rich at the gas station in town one afternoon. He was putting fuel in his pickup, but he wasn't looking at the pump. He was staring across the street at the bank, the big brick building with the white columns. He looked like a man staring at his executioner. He had lost weight, and his eyes had a haunted, hunted look. He saw me watching him, and for a moment I thought he might say something. Instead, he just got in his truck and drove away, his tires squealing a little as he pulled out onto the street. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something brittle and raw. The cracks weren't just in his operation anymore, they were in the man himself. By 1982, the farm crisis was a full-blown catastrophe. It wasn't just a downturn, it was a cleansing fire. The local paper, which used to be full of ads for new tractors, was now filled with legal notices. Foreclosure auctions. Every week, another family farm went under the hammer. These were not marginal operators, they were good, hard-working families who had been told to expand, who had believed the experts and the bankers, who had done everything they were supposed to do. Their American dream, built on $5 corn and easy credit, had become a nightmare of 21% interest and $2 corn. The auctioneers were the busiest men in the county, but their fast-talking patter had lost its cheerful ring. The crowds that gathered were not there in celebration, but in mourning. They came to watch their neighbors' lives be dismantled piece by piece, sold off to the highest bidder to satisfy a note in a bank vault 100 miles away. They watched in silence, their faces grim, knowing that it could be their turn next. The notice for Richard Peterson's auction appeared in the paper on a cold, grey Tuesday in March of 1983. It wasn't a surprise to anyone. We had all seen it coming. The list of equipment was staggering. The Steiger Panther tractor, the International 1482 axial flow combined with 2 heads, the big Kinsey planter, a whole line of tillage equipment. And then, at the bottom of the page, the words that turned a man's blood to ice. Also selling, at 1 p.m., 560 acres, more or less, of prime Henderson County farmland, to be sold in 3 parcels. The day of the auction was bitter, with a raw wind that cut through your coat. The sky was the color of lead. Half the county was there, parked along the gravel road leading to Rich's farmstead. They weren't there to bid, not really. Nobody had any money. They were there to bear witness. I saw Rich standing by the machine shed, his wife beside him. She was holding his arm, as if to keep him from falling. He looked like a ghost. His face was gaunt, his eyes were hollow, and he stared out at the crowd with a blank, unseeing expression. The slicked-back hair was gone, replaced by a cheap seed corn cap pulled down low. He was a king surveying the ruins of his kingdom. The auctioneer started with the small items, the tools and shop equipment. Things sold for nothing. A heavy-duty drill press went for $20. A Lincoln arc welder, a tool a man builds his life with, sold for $50. It was a slaughter. Then they moved to the big machinery. The Steiger Panther, the pride of his fleet, the machine he'd paid over $100,000 for, was driven up. The engine sounded strong, the tires were good. But the buyers were vultures. They knew the bank had to sell. The bidding was sluggish, pathetic. It stalled at $25,000. The auctioneer tried to work the crowd, but there was nothing there. "Sold," he finally cried, his voice flat. A man from a big corporate farm 2 counties over had bought it. He was going to get it home and paint it green. Next came the combine, the magnificent red machine that had been the symbol of Rich's triumph at that auction 4 years ago. It looked just as big, just as powerful. But the magic was gone. It was no longer a symbol of progress. It was a monument to a terrible mistake. It sold for $30,000. I survived because I owed nothing. While the bankers were picking apart Rich's empire, my life went on, albeit in a leaner, more careful way. My John Deere 7700 did the bulk of the work, but the old 95 was my ace in the hole. When a neighbor's newer, more complex combine went down with an electronic failure that required a specialist from the city, I took the tarp off the 95, fired up the old Detroit diesel, and helped him get his beans out before the snow flew. He tried to pay me, but I wouldn't take his money. "Just help the next man who needs it," I told him. My old iron, the stuff Rich and the others had laughed at, had become a lifeline. I could fix it. I understood it. It didn't rely on a computer chip or a banker's good graces. It relied on diesel fuel, grease, and my own 2 hands. I tightened my belt, lived off the money I had saved, and watched the storm rage around me, safe on the high ground of being debt-free. At 1 o'clock, the auctioneer moved to the land. The crowd grew quiet, the men taking off their hats as if they were in church. Selling a man's equipment is one thing, selling his land is another. You're selling his past and his future. The first parcel was the 160 acres he'd bought from the Hemlock estate. The bidding was slow, and it sold to an out-of-state insurance company for a fraction of what it had been worth just a few years earlier. The second parcel was the 240-acre Henderson place. The same insurance company bought that too. Rich didn't flinch. He just stood there, a statue of a man. Then came the last parcel. "All right, folks," the auctioneer said, his voice softer now. "Here it is. The home place. 160 acres with a house, barns, and grain bins. This is the original Peterson family farm." A deep, profound silence fell over the crowd. This was the heart of it all. The land Rich's grandfather had homesteaded, the ground his father had worked, the yard he'd grown up in. I looked over at Rich. A single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. His wife was openly weeping now, her face buried in his shoulder. The auctioneer started the bidding. The man from the insurance company opened at a lowball price. Another man, a local lawyer known for speculating, raised him. They went back and forth, their voices clinical and detached, carving up a man's soul in $100 increments. I had come with no intention of bidding. I was just there to watch, to see the end of it. But standing there, watching that family break apart, watching everything they had ever been sold off to strangers, something shifted inside me. This wasn't about vindication. It wasn't about being right. It was about decency. The bidding stalled. The lawyer had the high bid. The auctioneer looked to the insurance man, who slowly shook his head. "Going once," the auctioneer called out, his eyes scanning the crowd. "Going twice." My hand went up. A gasp went through the crowd. Every head turned to look at me, the quiet man in the back, the one they had all written off as a relic. The auctioneer's eyes widened in surprise. "I have a bid from Earl Miller." The lawyer, annoyed, immediately raised my bid. I raised him back without hesitation. We went back and forth, the numbers climbing. The crowd was dead silent, watching the two of us. I wasn't looking at the lawyer. I was looking at Rich. He had lifted his head, his eyes locked on mine, a look of utter, stunned disbelief on his face. The price was getting high, higher than I had planned. It would take nearly every dollar I had saved. But I thought of my father, and his father before him. I thought of what it meant to have a place, a piece of earth that was yours. The lawyer bid again. I took a deep breath and raised him one last time, a firm, final number. I put every ounce of conviction I had into the simple gesture of raising my hand. The lawyer hesitated. He looked at me, then at the crowd, then back at the auctioneer. He shook his head and shoved his hands in his pockets. "Sold," the auctioneer shouted, his voice booming in the stillness. "To Earl Miller." A wave of murmurs washed over the crowd. I didn't move. I just stood there, my heart pounding in my chest. I had just bought the Peterson home place. I walked over to the clerk's table and signed the papers, my hand steady. When I was done, I walked over to Rich. He stood apart from his wife now, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He wouldn't look at me. He just stared at the ground. "Why, Earl?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. "To gloat? To finally prove you were right?" "No, Rich," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "That's not it." I held out a piece of paper I had just scribbled on. It was a rental agreement, a simple one-page lease for the farm I had just bought. The terms were fair, maybe even a little too generous in his favor. He looked at the paper, then up at me, his eyes clouded with confusion. "What is this?" "It's your farm," I said. "You're going to run it. You're going to pay me rent when you can, and we'll settle up at the end of the year. You're going to raise your family in that house. It's your name on the mailbox, not mine." He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. The dam of his pride, the last thing he had left, finally broke. He collapsed against the side of the barn, his body shaking with great, racking sobs. I just stood there, giving him a moment. I wasn't his savior, I was just a neighbor. And his land, the land his grandfather had broken, was still his to work. The years that followed were lean, but they were healing years. The farm crisis slowly receded, leaving deep scars on the landscape and the people. A lot of families never came back. The insurance companies and corporate farms owned a lot more ground than they used to. But the community, what was left of it, was stronger, humbler. The talk at the co-op changed. Men who had once bragged about their new machinery now traded tips on how to rebuild a water pump or weld a broken axle. They started coming to me, asking for advice. They'd stop by my workshop, hands in their pockets, and ask how I kept that old 4020 running so sweet, or where I found parts for the 7700. I never mentioned the past. I never once said, "I told you so." I just shared what I knew. Respect is a quiet thing, and it's earned in the workshop, not the banker's office. Rich and I became friends in a way. It was a friendship forged in the crucible of his failure and my refusal to let it be the end of him. He was a changed man. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet humility. He was a hell of a farmer, and once the burden of debt was lifted, he thrived. He farmed his home place and rented a few other fields. He bought good, used equipment, and he learned how to fix it himself. We'd help each other during harvest, sharing labor and machinery, the way neighbors were always meant to. One fall afternoon, years later, my grandson, a boy of about 10, was riding with me in the cab of the 4020 as I was plowing. He was fascinated by the old tractor, the open station, the roar of the engine, the smell of the diesel and the turned earth. "Grandpa," he asked, shouting over the noise, "why don't you have a big new tractor? Like those ones with the computers and the quiet cabs?" I throttled the engine down, and the roar subsided to a deep, rumbling idle. I pointed to the farmhouse, the barns, the fields stretching out before us, all gold and brown in the late afternoon sun. "You see all this?" I asked him. "It's ours, not the bank's, not anybody else's. Ours. This tractor," I said, patting the green fender, warm from the engine, "is a tool, a good one. It does the work. But it's not the reason we're here. We're here because my father and his father knew the difference between a tool and a debt. A tool helps you work the land. A debt can take the land away from you." I pointed over to the machine shed. Through the open door, you could just see the front of the old John Deere 95 combine, covered in a dusty tarp. "That machine in there taught me the most important lesson of all," I told him. "It's better to be slow and free than fast and beholden to someone else." He was quiet for a moment, just a boy trying to understand a man's world. Then he nodded, a serious look on his young face. I pushed the throttle forward again, and the big 6-cylinder engine sang its powerful song. The plowshares bit deep into the rich black soil, turning over another year, another season. The land endured. And we were still here, on our own ground, under our own power, free and clear.